we're going to have, as I said, an interesting afternoon. The afternoon will start with a presentation by Professor Newell. Professor Newell is co-editor of Contemporary Italian Politics and is professor at the University of Salford, correct?
That's right.
And we really appreciate that he came from England here to join us in this analysis of the Italian elections of March 4, 2018. He's going to tell us about Italy as seen from abroad. Thank you very much, Jim. Please.
Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me. I'm very delighted to be here. Yes, I'm going to be talking about the Italian elections from an international perspective. And when I was asked to do this, it struck me, first of all, that there are a number of things that happened in the election which have commonalities throughout Europe. So essentially what I wanted to do was to pinpoint some of these commonalities and to reflect on their significance for democratic party politics, both in Italy and more generally. And the five features that struck me in particular, I guess, were first of all, turnout; secondly, party system change; thirdly, the decline in support for the PD and the changing significance of social class; the role of populist parties in the election, and the role of the EU in the election. Well, if we have a look at turnout first of all, though it was 2% below the turnout in 2013, turnout actually showed a decline in the rate of decline, and this reflects, or rather not the turnout, not the decline in the rate of decline, but rather the decline in turnout reflects a trend that is common across Europe generally. It strikes me that this is perhaps surprising if one sort of bears in mind, I don't know whether it's correct to call them common stereotypes, because I'm not sure to what extent the international data from surveys like the European Social Survey actually bear it out, but certainly I guess one of the common stereotypes about Italian politics is that Italians are particularly cynical about politics, and that anti-party and anti-political sentiments are particularly widespread in Italy. So I guess it's rather surprising to see that despite the decline in turnout, nevertheless, turnout tends to remain higher in Italy than in other European countries. I'm surprised by that, I suppose, because before the 1990s, you could perhaps explain relatively high Italian turnouts in terms of the fact that elections were very ideological affairs. They were essentially Christ versus communism elections, and yet, as you can see from those figures, despite the party system change, turnout continues to remain rather higher in Italy than elsewhere. Moving on then to party system change. By that I mean, and here I feel rather strange, because what I'm now going to say very much takes its cue from a recent article written by Alessandro Chiaramonte and Vincenzo Emanuele in Party Politics. It's rather strange to be presenting somebody else's work when the author is sitting just about a metre in front of you. However, by party system change, taking my cue from these authors, I mean a process whereby the routine, stable and predictable patterns of interaction between parties seem to have become less so over time. So that is a process of party system deinstitutionalization that's been partly revealed at European level by the well-known increases in electoral volatility that we've seen in recent elections and are reflected in those figures. In fact, since total volatility is a measure of the extent of change in the distribution of the vote between parties from one election to the next, and therefore of party system instability, Volatility, as the authors point out, is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for deinstitutionalization or change. Another necessary condition is that a significant part of this volatility is accounted for by the disappearance of old parties and the emergence of new ones, while a third necessary condition is that elections fulfilling the first two conditions tend to occur sequentially, or at least a cluster within a certain period of time. We can then calculate for a series of elections, first of all, those changes in the distribution of the vote caused by the entry and exit of parties from the political system, what the authors call regeneration. Secondly, those changes that take place when voters shift their votes between existing parties in the system, what the authors call alteration, or alternation, I can't quite remember. And finally, and most importantly, the significance of regeneration, in other words, the proportion of total volatility that it accounts for. And this the authors measure as the ratio between regeneration and total volatility. So it's something that varies between 0 and 100%. So that then enables the authors to sort the 336 elections since the war belonging to their sample into 4 types that we can see in that table there, according to their level of electoral volatility and to the salience of party system regeneration. The cut-off points are represented by the 2 mean values, respectively 10.25 for total volatility and 12.14% for the salience of regeneration. And among the interesting things that we can see in the figure are, first of all, that the proportion of stable elections with little regeneration goes down from about 51% in the first period to 30% in the third, while the proportion of unstable elections, in other words, elections with above average total volatility and significant regeneration, goes up. So the question then is, if European systems seem indeed to have undergone a general shift towards instability and change in recent years, how does the 4th of March election fit into this picture? Well, I haven't got time to go through all the various calculations, but what I can tell you and what you can find on the Centre for Italian Electoral Studies website in another piece written by Alessandro is that total volatility on the 4th of March was 26.7%. I did a little calculation hoping that I got it correct in terms of the procedures for doing it, but I worked out that the proportion of regeneration volatility as a ratio of total volatility was 4.2%, which would actually place the 4th of March election in the bottom right-hand corner there, and I'm very gratified to see that Alessandro is nodding there, so I got that right. So I guess that's perhaps not surprising because, of course, the great election where we saw instability with regeneration was the one in 2013. What about the decline in support for the PD then? Well, as we know, the support for the PD went from 25.4% to 18.7%, meaning that the party lost almost 30% of the support it had had in 2013. And in fact, in terms of gross figures, the PD now has at 6 million votes or thereabouts, pretty much half the support it had in 2008, if you take account the losses it suffered in 2013 as well. Now, again, this reflects similar dramatic declines over a similar period of time for other mainstream parties of the left in Europe, as you can see in that table there. Yep, that's the correct table. And in fact, what we can see from that table is that the mainstream left has for the most part, including in Italy, been undergoing a decline for a considerably longer period than just the last 10 years, prompting the questions, first of all, how can we explain it? And to what extent does any explanation we come up with apply to the Italian case, or to what extent do we have to account for the decline of the centre-left in Italy by appealing to factors peculiar to the Italian situation? Well, As far as the first question is concerned, the theories about this are well known. They revolve around the idea that we've seen a decline in the significance of mass parties, of which the left represented the classic example. There have been a whole series of economic, social and cultural changes which Paolo talked about in his presentation that have brought about a change in the nature of political campaigning and a decline in the extent to which voting choices are influenced by hereditary and prescriptive ties. We've seen a growth in the forces of globalization with a consequent decline in the capacities of national governments to manage their own economies. As a consequence of this, there's been a tendency of the centre-left parties to lose any kind of cultural ascendancy, especially since the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and so to incorporate the narratives of their adversaries on the right, with the result of failing to offer representation to, and thereby to constitute as such a working class that now feels threatened by the effects of globalization, especially austerity and mass migration. And so that the left's natural constituency has thus been left prey to alternative appeals, with the inevitable consequence being a dramatic advance for populist and anti-immigrant parties of the right, represented in the March election by the League, of course. So that's the first question. As far as the second question is concerned, it's equally well known, I think, that many of the explanations that I've just referred to, particularly the decline of mass parties, apply equally to Italy as they do to other European countries. There you've got the figures for the decline in party membership figures Europe-wide, including Italy. The extent to which the centre-left's decline might be due to factors peculiar to Italy is a question that I'm struggling with, to be honest. But something that I'm more sure about is that related to the growing significance of the forces of globalization that I mentioned, there has been a shift in the class profile of the voters of mainstream left parties, and that applies as much to other countries as it does to Italy. We know that one of the effects of globalization has been to bring about a reduction in inequality between countries while bringing about an increase in inequality within countries. And so, again, as Paolo referred to this morning, one of the effects of this has been to bring about a growing gulf between winners and losers, whereby the winners would be those in salaried occupations that have been relatively protected from the increasing mobility of social capital, especially if they've been able to save and invest, since the possession of even modest share portfolios makes it possible to participate in the process of global capitalist expansion. So there's been a growth in the gap between these people and the working class, those entirely dependent on wage labour for their subsistence, but no longer identify themselves as working class as such, thanks to the loss of cultural ascendancy that I referred to a moment ago. So, as a result of that, what you've had is the development of a situation in which those who are in rather protected positions, the winners that I mentioned, they have tended to desert the centre-left parties in rather fewer numbers than have the losers, the traditional working class, if you like. Especially, I think, because the winners tend not only to be winners in terms of finding their situations less threatened by globalization, but they're also more in tune with the sort of cultural themes of international solidarity, the more liberal approaches of left-wing parties on non-economic issues than are their less fortunate brethren, if I can put it like that. And so, as many of you in the room will be perfectly well aware, I know, there has been some research which got a considerable amount of publicity, which was carried out by Lorenzo Di Sio, and again, which you can find on the Centre for Italian Studies, Italian Centre for Electoral Studies website, which demonstrates, among other things, that when you ask people about their self-perceived class location, the PD got 13% among the self-perceived working class, 18.3% among the self-perceived middle class, and 31.2% among the self-perceived upper middle class. And as I said, I think that reflects similar changes going on elsewhere. As you probably know, we had an election in Britain in 2017. That was an election which, thanks to the collapse in support of the United Kingdom Independence Party in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum, both support for both the Conservatives and the Labour Party went up. But interestingly, support for the Labour Party went up much more among the winners than it did among the losers, as you can see from that table there. And so the Labour Party, like the PD, has found that the balance, if you like, of its support has shifted towards the winners and away from the losers. So there is that similarity. On the other hand, I think we're in the presence of a paradox here, because I think what Lorenzo's research suggests is that whereas in Italy class has become more significant as a variable in electoral and party politics, in Britain, which is supposed to be the patria per eccellenza of social class, as was mentioned this morning, there was this famous quote from Pulitzer, which is repeated over and over again, that class is the basis of British party politics, all else is embellishment and detail. But paradoxically, the significance of class in party politics has gone down quite considerably. What I think is, and this is, I guess, the important political point and the point for research, is that both, I think, the PD and the Labour Party now find them in a situation that they are attempting to represent people whose interests may not be compatible. They both have electorates which belong to the winners and losers, and so somehow they have to try and reconcile the different interests and rather contrasting outlooks, particularly on things like immigration of those two groups. And so I think it's for that reason that, for instance, you can see in those figures that the Labour Party has significant support among both Remainers and losers in the Brexit referendum, and the distinction between voting Remain and Leave was very similar, or mirrored very closely this distinction between winners and losers, with Remainers being winners and losers being leavers. And that perhaps explains why the Labour Party's position on Brexit has continued to be, unfortunately from my point of view, because I have to say, as a citizen of a soon-to-be ex-EU country, I did very much support Remain. However, that's beside the point, I guess. Okay, so let's go on to populist parties then. So populist parties, as at least we think we know, have seen a dramatic increase in their support in Europe in recent years, and many people have said in relation to the March the 4th election that it represented something of a revolution, in the sense that, you know, for the first time you had populist parties with over 50% of the vote, which was thought to represent something of a novelty. So the question then, I think, is how true is this? It would seem to me that much of the answer would appear to depend on whether we can call the Five Star Movement a populist party or not. If with Casmuda we define populism as a thin-centred ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people versus the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the general will of the people, then without wanting to claim any kind of expertise in the matter of populism, I would want to argue that that definition accurately captures a style of political communication that, thanks to the growing mediatization of campaigning, has become increasingly characteristic not only of new outsider and challenger parties in recent years, but of mainstream parties in general, as many have argued. However, I would argue that populism can also be reflected in public policy proposals, not only political communication, in public policy proposals and political projects, that from the fact that a party has a populist communication style, it doesn't necessarily follow that the party will also be populist in terms of policy or project. Thirdly, that the genuinely populist party is one that not only claims to represent the interests of the pure people against the corrupt elite, but claims to have a monopoly on the ability to do so, where the corrupt elite is not just any old elite, but is represented by competitor parties. And therefore, for a genuinely populist party is one that implicitly and sometimes explicitly challenges the liberal component of liberal democracy by implying from three that the support of a majority of the people alone is sufficient to justify actions when in office, and B, that other parties are not legitimate contenders for government. So while I think that the diatribes against the so-called post-comunisti and his claim that popular election entitled him to immunity from prosecution, Berlusconi, at least in terms of communication and rhetoric, was a classic example of a populist leader. My perception is that the Five Star Movement, with its diatribes against La Casta, certainly has strongly populist characteristics in terms of its rhetoric. It also does tend to imply, I think, that it has a monopoly on the ability to represent ordinary people. We saw from Filippo's presentation this morning that a lot of its communication is very much centered around this idea that all other parties are illegitimate. You know, we are the only authentic representatives of the people. But I think I would want to go further than that and to suggest that its dismissal of liberal principles in that sense is also reflected in one of its flagship policies with its apparent ambition to abolish in the name of the people against La Casta, Article 67 of the Constitution, which stipulates that each member of Parliament represents the nation and carries out their duties without a binding mandate. For the movement, I think the Member of Parliament should not be free of mandates because its conception of parliamentarians is not that they are trustees but are delegates. I think that's the classic binary distinction between conceiving of representation. Is the representative a trustee, free to use his or her will in taking decisions about how to represent the people he or she has been elected by, or are they actually a delegate mandated by the people? So I think the movement has a mandate conception of the Member of Parliament. It believes that the Member of Parliament should not be free of mandates. And in my view, that is populist because it eliminates the space for deliberation and so offends against the liberal principle that decisions should be preceded by authentic discussion and debate and not merely the aggregation of preferences that occurs in voting. I think on balance it's fair to describe the Five Star Movement as a populist party, but having said that, I'm less convinced that the Five Star Movement is something that one should worry about from a democratic perspective, because I think we have at least four reasons for thinking that it's far more likely that the Five Star Movement will find that it's the system that changes it rather than that it will change the system. The four reasons that I have in mind are, first of all, from the election campaign itself, when the movement seemed to be rather concerned to try and reassure the elites of various kinds, including the City of London, to reassure them that it was a reliable party of government. Secondly, I think it's found on a variety of fronts that there are various institutional pressures to conform, which it's been unable to go against, if you like. I mean, there are numerous examples of this, but I mean, one of them is for instance, the belief that the parliamentary group leader should periodically rotate among its group members. Well, the movement then found, when it got elected to Parliament, that the leader had a whole series of legal responsibilities, including being the employer of the group's personnel, with the result that the rotation simply wasn't possible without having to tear up a whole series of contracts and rewrite them every time the group leader was changed. Thirdly, of course, the movement lacks an overall majority, and so as an outsider party, it continues to face the various dilemmas that tend to handicap such parties, the dilemma about whether to join government or not, and then having joined government, do you try to satisfy hardcore supporters by taking a hardline position on your core policies with the risk of alienating more moderate supporters, but then if you do that you alienate the hardliners and so forth. And I think there's plenty of evidence around Europe of populist parties being elected to government and then suffering considerable decline precisely because they find these dilemmas difficult to manage. And then fourthly, I think even if the Five-Star Movement were at some time able to form a government with an overall majority and therefore in a position to legislate for some of its most significant ideas, for instance, it's one that's been downplayed at the recent election, but prior to that, of course, we had the possibility, I guess it was never very clear the extent to which it was taken seriously, but this referendum on Europe, on membership of the Euro, which would be very, very difficult to organise for a whole host of constitutional reasons, including the fact that the Constitution prohibits the holding of referenda on laws authorising the ratification of international treaties. What I think the Five-Star Movement will find it particularly difficult to cope with is, and again, we talked about this a little bit this morning, particularly in relation to Filippo's contribution. Of course, it gets support from across the left-right spectrum. Well, I guess when you join government, you move from being a party of protest to being a party that has to make decisions which inevitably have left-right connotations. And so to what extent the movement would be able to continue to persist in its refusal of accepting any kind of left-right location and therefore to hang on to this support from across the political spectrum, I'm not sure about. How am I doing for time? Should I stop there? Okay. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you.
Actually,